club's first trophy since Nottingham Forest won the European Cup back in 1980.
Nottingham Forest have done it again.
It was a long time since Nottingham Forest had reigned as kings of Europe. In a decade that began with the European Cup, Brian Clough was treading water, until he revived the club. Now then, where were we? Oh yes, Nottingham Forest had one hand tied behind their back because of new financial rules, English clubs being barred from European competition, and Brian Clough's powers waning underneath the crippling weight of modern football. At least he had his assistant manager back. Alan Hill was coaxed back from Notts County as Forest paid £19,000 after a year without him. The manager pledged his future to the club too, signing a 2-year contract. In the early days of the 1988-89 campaign, there was a small sense of optimism. Nigel Clough had banged in 20 goals the season before, and the first Forest player to do that in ages. A trophy was won, who cares if it was in the Mercantile Credit Trophy, a bizarre weekend tournament of short-sided games to celebrate the centenary of English football. No matter how small, it was skin on trophy contact. Clough was hoping it would have a galvanising effect on the club, like how they had won the Anglo-Scottish Trophy in 1977 before winning the league and 2 European Cups. Despite waning finances in comparison to the big boys, which were apparently now called the Big Five, Liverpool, Everton, Man United, Arsenal and Spurs, Forest posted profits of $710,000, and after finally paying off the executive stand, the club were able to go into the transfer market swinging. Nigel Jemson, Gary Parker, Brian Laws, Steve Hodge, Lee Chapman all in. Mark Crosley would make his debut, ascending from 4th choice goalkeeper to number 1 after Hans Sager's loan out to Genk and the injuries to Steve Stutton and Paul Crichton. He'd make the most of it. First game of the season, Clough pulled a trick you might have seen Don Revie pull on the Damned United film against Clough Derby back in the late 60s, stopping the team coach outside the ground and walking the remainder in approach to Carrow Road for their season opener.
Crook, and Dale Gordon's arriving with some space. Flick, and here comes the fullback Bowen. Oh, lovely strike.
Alright, so they lost 2-1 and then drew 5 on the spin. Normally the season was over at New Year, but this time the summer hadn't even fucked off yet. Just what was all the optimism for? Well, first they'd notch wins over QPR and then more impressively Liverpool before the League Cup pitched up and, well, this happened.
Nigel Clough took an excellent pass from Wilson to set up Foster, who levelled the scores from an oblique angle.
For him, and he finds him. And a good run by the young fullback. And it's pulled back. And it's in. Clough has given Nottingham Forest the lead.
To Hodge and Pearce, and that was Chapman's 4th.
Clough was busy telling everyone who would listen that this was his strongest ever Forest squad, and just when Brian Howard Clough had re-risen to something of a relevancy again, he seemed intent on knocking himself, and others but more physically, back down. By now he could effectively walk on the Trent if he wanted to, so the letters of support came flooding in, but it was the closest his tenure came to ending, not on his own volition of course. The FA banned him for 3 months from the touchline and fined him £5,000, and yet they could just about reach out and touch Wembley.
If Parker got another chance, he'd probably take it. He's a good finisher, a good shooter, and he's really done well on that one.
3rd division, but Bristol City gave Forest an almighty scare, but nonetheless Clough was back at the National Stadium for the first time since 1980. Given their opponents were Luton Town, Forest were marked out as overwhelming favourites.
Turning a good cross back in there again. Neil Webb is further forward than any other. There's Webb. The 6-yard box is Nigel Clough again.
Incidentally, that was Clough's 7th major trophy. Don Revie only had 6 whilst at Leeds United, just a little cherry on top of the icing of a wonderful Wembley cake. This was Brian Clough and Nottingham Forest now motoring towards a treble of domestic cups. League Cup chalked off and a return to Wembley would not take long. Alright, it was in the full Members' Cup or Simod Cup to bow down to the marketing god, but it came against an Everton in a match destined to be competitive. Also the prospect of an FA Cup semi-final against Liverpool for the 2nd successive year at Hillsborough. Of course, I'm not going to show the pictures from that event, but I do feel the need to repeat the remarks and opinion that Brian Clough left in the air unforgivably for 12 years. parroting the remarks of a certain newspaper that Liverpool fans were the ones to blame. Thankfully, he'd row back on those comments in 2001. After the necessary pause English football underwent, Forest tuned up for Wembley by beating Clough's hometown team Middlesbrough 4-3 ahead of the Simod Cup final.
Centre here, it's Tony Cottee for Everton. Parker! Sharp, will he reach it? He will! Up but Parker's going all the way himself. Chapman, he can put Forest in front here. It's a fine cross, Cottee! Clear run at goal, Chapman!
Normally this was not of any remote importance, but thanks to a lack of Europe, you could genuinely chalk this up as a cup double. Now it was to Old Trafford to see if the flickering light of a potential treble could stay aflame. It had taken Clough until the prior year to go so far into the FA Cup. Now was the time to see if we could go that extra step this time.
Comes to Barnes. Good stop by Sutton. Back to Liverpool, but Webb. Is it over the line? I think it's a goal. Looking to link here with Barnes. Now Beardsley.
It was a game that Clough remarked, "I'd rather not be doing this, I'd rather be sitting at home." Such was the sentiment of the entire footballing world, that Liverpool probably should be allowed to walk to the trophy for all the loss and tragedy they had incurred. A trio of trophies for Forest, just a step too far, but this was a team now firmly with smoke blown up their arse, with real trophies to speak of. In fact, every part of Nottingham Forest was successful. The reserve side won the league, the under-18s won the Midland Youth Cup. Leeds' John Sheridan replaced Neil Webb at a sizeable turnover, and season ticket money had ticked over the £1 million barrier for the very first time. It ought to have been a superb start. And of course, Forest won only one of their first 7 matches.
It's Jimmy Carter who finishes well. It's a good start for Millwall. The cross is completely misjudged by Steve Sutton. More mercy punishing the error.
Naturally, soon enough they would rack up enough wins to ease any half-arsed relegation fears, but this was clearly not a Forest side for the league, but for the Cups, as the return of the old faithful League Cup proved.
Here, he's made the way in the middle as well. This could kill him off. It's 4. Played it in.
Ford Hodge has collected it. My word, you have to hand it to Nottingham Forest.
Forest were on the precipice of Wembley for the 3rd time in less than a year, and yet the cup match, which had the biggest historical weight attached in this time, was yet another 3rd round exit from the FA Cup, this time against Manchester United, which arguably saved Alex Ferguson's job and prompted their run to the trophy 5 months later. At the turn of the year, Neil Webb's replacement was gone, Lee Chapman, at a £250k loss to Leeds, as Clough exclaimed, "What have I signed him for? He can't tackle, he can't head, he can't run. What the fuck have I signed him for?" Chapman would go on to be a crucial cog in the Leeds title-winning machine 2 years later. David Curry was through the door for 700 grand, but he would play only 8 matches before being flogged. The manager was clearly losing his touch, the critics said. Clough didn't care about any of that. The club was bound for Wembley once again. Wembley in the crosshairs, but league form had long since disintegrated, losing 7 between the semi and the final. They simply had to win the League Cup to salvage any sort of pride from the season.
Way up forward now, and Jensen with a chance for Forest. He's done it! Forest have stretched the lead.
The only time Nottingham Forest had ever won trophies in 3 consecutive seasons was in Clough's heyday between 78 and 80, with the winning of the league and 2 European Cups. He was said to have lost his magic by his critics. He'd certainly lost his sidekick Peter Taylor, but still, he was on course to repeat that treble come 1991. Also, you can scrap what I said earlier about Clough's eye for a transfer, because Roy Keane had come in from Cove Ramblers for just 10 grand. He'd prove a bargain, but at the time the biggest piece of business was persuading Des Walker to stay for another year, despite all of the Italian overtures sent in his direction. Forest were relatively moneyed, but had failed to scoop up a big signing, probably because Clough had been burned so prolifically the campaign prior. His one signing was chucked in at the deep end, and it would be Roy Keane who wound up being Neil Webb's long-awaited, inexpensive replacement. Meanwhile, Nigel Jemson shot to form in the early stages of the 1991 campaign.
Rush, perfectly timed break, at last. Rush, Peter Beardsley, yes!
Not that Forest were in any kind of good form. They had only managed to win when Southampton turned up at the City Ground in the fourth match of the season, and they wouldn't claim another victory until the end of September. The club was still lodged in that league malaise, a funk if you will, but still Clough penned himself another 3 years at the club. Surely they couldn't keep riding the crest of the League Cup wave forever in order to keep themselves relevant. The answer was emphatically no, they could not. That October, news of Peter Taylor's death reached Clough. They hadn't spoken for the last 7 years of his life. Clough, already withdrawn from the modern game, became increasingly removed from his players and the training ground as the drink took over more and more. And yet he was still able to rule over Nottingham Forest, the club that he helped make. By the time Palace were overcome after 3 games of an FA Cup third round tie, it was Clough and Forest's last chance at silverware because Barnsley had put them out of the Zenith Data Systems Cup, just the latest name people were calling the Full Members Cup. Their inconsistencies in the league only came to the fore with cup distraction as 1990 became 91.
Crosby coming in, Keane as well. It's Jemson! Jemson, Keane, it's in!
Keane again, it's Roy Keane! It's 2-0 Forest!
Only when Wembley was confirmed did Forest return to any kind of form in the league, the most violent of which saw Chelsea the victims as they were pumped by 7 a full week after the FA Cup semi-final was won against West Ham. Forest had climbed to 8th for the second season running in advance of a 4th trip to Wembley in 3 seasons, arguably the formed team in the entire country. In the capital they would meet Tottenham Hotspur for an instant classic.
Oh, it's in! And Crosby has saved it! Not with a chance for Spurs. And the equaliser fortune to put the ball in his own net to give Tottenham the lead.
From the Gascoigne tackle to the Pierce free kick and the Lineker penalty miss, ultimately it would be the faithful Des Walker spooning a header into his own net that settled an FA Cup final. Gone was the perfect chance for Clough to ride off into the sunset, having completed the set of English footballing trophies. Now he had to go again, but by now it was obvious his powers were gone. He handed a pay rise to Steve Hodge in advance of the final that was so insignificant that he moved heaven and earth to leave Forest that summer. The manager remained on the front foot, however, going in for Dean Saunders, but the Welshman was so put off by the manager's drunkenness at a transfer meeting, he rejected him. Gary McAllister snubbed Clough too. In the end, Forest signed Kingsley Black from Luton Town, before finally settling on a frontman of decent renown in Millwall's Teddy Sheringham. The sale of Des Walker was becoming more tempting by the year, but Clough had managed to rebuff a massive £5 million bid from Sampdoria. Another success, even if it did mean he would leave for £1.5 million 12 months later. And whilst Alan Mahood came and went without playing a game owing to injury, Ian Woan was purchased and ultimately lasted a decade. Despite all the upheaval to the squad in the off-season, Clough was adamant that a title chase was possible thanks to the trident of his own son, Sheringham, and Jemson up front. By September, after more defeat than victory, that little experiment was over. Jemson sold to Sheffield Wednesday, joining Gary Parker on the scrap heap, who departed for Villa. In truth, the league season was going as you'd expect from this time. Horribly, as Forest skirted relegation as late as November. Clough's big money signing Sheringham wasn't even hitting the target either, going 11 without scoring, but it was about that time of the year again The League Cup was sent for and it was obedient as usual.
Second, in strength and skill, finishing it off.
The 2-0 win sealed by Scott Gemmell.
Keane hits it splendidly and now Pierce.
Back again for Gemmell. Might come again for him. It's a goal there. Beautifully shot there by Lee Glover.
Despite all of the malaise and wane of Clough's powers, Forest were Wembley bound once again. 6 days after their progression to yet another final in a remarkable spell of cup form, Forest had the chance to extend that with a trip to Fratton Park, with the winner qualifying for the semi-final of the FA Cup.
Easy one for... Oh my word! What was Mark Crossley doing?
With the FA Cup gone, the road to the League Cup final and Manchester United wouldn't be straightforward. For one, Clough wasn't so sure of his goalkeeper Mark Crossley, who he would call shithouse Barnsley, or, because he went to pieces in the box, Jigsaw. His potential criminal charges for a fracas in his hometown of Barnsley hardly helped, and Clough dropped him for the final despite selling Steve Sutton to Derby in advance of the big occasion. Therefore, Forest went into the game fielding third choice Welshman Andy Marriott.
Little ball very clear for McClare again! A goal for Manchester United!
The sky was falling in. Brian Clough had missed yet another opportunity to ride off into the sunset without a blot on his copybook and with another winner's medal in his back pocket. Much worse, the club chairman was forced to quit after he was arrested for fraud within his accountancy firm. Apparently it was a whole new ball game, so Clough decided to turbocharge his 4-4-2 as he met the Premier League eye to eye. Nigel Clough playing off Teddy Sheringham with two out-and-out wingers. Forest, as was natural with old Big Ed in charge of them, were earmarked as potential title challengers. They would have the privilege of hosting the first ever televised Premier League game against Liverpool. And the goal scorer Teddy Sheringham would wind up with the first ever Premier League Golden Boot. Such a big shame then that Clough had binned him off to Spurs and he scored the rest of his 21 goals for Tottenham Hotspur. Meanwhile, Forest's best league's marksman was Nigel Clough with a comparatively dour 10. Joining Sheringham in departing the City ground was a long-awaited sale of Des Walker to Sampdoria. They might have just survived too had his defensive partner Darren Wassall not followed him out the door. If Forest had looked like a team capable of challenging the best of the best on the opening weekend, then they were distinctly ordinary for the remainder, beginning with Oldham's humiliating 5-goal haul.
Pierce gets in the tackle, breaks to Bernard, and a beautiful chip there with his left foot into the top right-hand corner of Crossley's net.
So was Shearer's response. 6 goals in 6 games.
The loss at newly promoted Blackburn Rovers had Forest officially rooted to the bottom of the division. Nonetheless, Crossley was back in goal, but he had the ignominious honour of scoring the Premier League's first ever own goal. Nottingham Forest could not be stopped in their demotion, and this time there would be no distractions, at least not on the field, courtesy of those good old cup competitions running sour.
For Campbell, for right, deflected, goal! Shelley, that's a fine header over the top of Tyler for right! And Pierce, and still right, and still right!
Maybe there was some macabre pride in losing to the eventual winners of both competitions. Weeks apart, on the same ground, to the same team, by the same scoreline, with the same goal scorer scoring the same brace. Either way, the season would retrospectively become known for the rumblings of Clough receiving backhanders, as pointed out in Jonathan Wilson's book on the manager from the infamous agent Runa Haag, whose gifts ended the George Graham tenure at Highbury a couple of years later. Suspicion started when Alf-Inge Haaland was bought for 150 grand, but the books stated that the club had paid 350 grand with, for those mathematicians out there, 200k unaccounted for, and it only intensified when Spurs chief Alan Sugar stuck his beak into the situation. This and a relegation fight is what ended Clough's managerial tenure, not the litany of missed opportunities of bequeathing the club one last trophy. Speculation about Clough's future rumbled on throughout the season as he was given the freedom of the city midway through the campaign. Scant consolation and perhaps a light at the end of the managerial tunnel, given the club's form in the second half of the season.
The goal in 4 matches in a row at Goodison Park, but here he hits the back of the net.
As Clough missed out on players like Laurent Blanc, Andy Cole and the almighty Craig Short, Forest's descent was nearing its confirmation, but they did sign Neil Webb though, again. Names like Dean Saunders and Stan Collymore were being bandied about again for a replacement up front. They did sign Robert Rosario though, which really does beg the question, who the fuck is Robert Rosario? The Everton loss had Clough on the ropes with the dreaded vote of confidence. If this was Championship manager, he'd be gone within 2 weeks. And yet, it was that revered that he survived the ordeal, as the supporters chanted "sack the board" and rebel directors attempted to overthrow the entire club's control onto themselves. Steve Stone made his debut. Gary Crosby, famous for this goal, was back from injury, and Forest briefly found themselves out of the drop zone. A win over Southampton gave Clough enough ammunition to believe that they didn't need to spend £1.75 million on Stan Collymore. They had enough firepower. After all, they were only 1 point away from safety now, behind teams like Crystal Palace and Sheffield United, and the season had enough legs left in it yet. 8 more matches remained. Then Villa beat them, then Stuart Pearce was ruled out for the rest of the season, and finally Blackburn beat them again to leave Forest bottom again. Their latest madcap defeat, 4-3 away to QPR, wasn't even the maddest part of that week. Rosario managed to find the net for once, Gary Charles was done for drink driving, and the chairman was finally convicted of fraud. Just one normal week of Nottingham Forest will never happen. Thankfully, 2 days later came the reprieve against another London club. Trust it to be Spurs, charitable in handing 3 points to those in need in a relegation dogfight. Unfortunately, their next 2 capital opponents wouldn't be so generous. First, Wimbledon pitched up and claimed a 1-0 win, which stretched the gap between Forest and safety to 3 points. Before a heroic, if a little unsatisfying, 1-1 draw against sudden foes, Arsenal left Forest needing a miracle with 2 games to play. Come the final home game of the season against Sheffield United on May the 1st, Forest needed a win to take things to the final day.
And still Hodges is opened up for him, and that is a top-class finish. Hartfield, on Gale, a free header, and a goal for Sheffield United.
They didn't, and with the leak that Clough was to retire at the end of the season no matter what, a final outpouring of grief came against Sheffield United with relegation confirmed. After the emotional afternoon, Barry Davies asked Brian Clough if he could have a word for television. Clough's reply was simple: goodbye. Clough admitted that the fans shouldn't have been subjected to the abject relegation, a season of humiliating drift towards the Football League. It was in these years that Clough realised he couldn't win the league again. For one, there was the financial might of others and a strong duopoly of Liverpool and Arsenal under the control of Kenny Dalglish and George Graham. The Cups simply had to do, and in shedding themselves of the belief of a league tilt, Forest became prolific again, even if Clough couldn't get his hands on the trophy he really wanted, the FA Cup. Ultimately, Clough and Forest parted ways because of the freshly moneyed vehicle called the Premier League, and now everyone was too strong for Forest. They couldn't compete against even some of the smaller clubs the division had to offer. Almost 20 years in the job, the momentum simply wasn't there. The game was becoming more modern. Clough was yesterday's man, still wedded to his laissez-faire 4-4-2 and a stubborn refusal to practice set pieces. Well, here's a video of him in his pomp when he was busy winning European Cups.